Hey, welcome, men. It is so glad to see you in a sense, in a way I'm seeing you. But a couple of announcements before we jump into it. First of all, I'm Pat McCullough. I'm one of the teaching pastors here at Cornerstone. But one of the things we really encourage you to do is like this, share it with other people. Also, if you haven't downloaded the CS Men's app, do that at some point. There's a lot of great information on there as well. Well, we are jumping into the first week of the parables. We're going to spend a couple of weeks looking at these stories that Jesus told 2,000 years ago. Stories have always been something that connects people, something that we learn well with, but especially 2,000 years ago when Jesus was here on earth in person, one of the ways that they would teach, the rabbis, the teachers, the speakers in that day, is they would teach through story or through parables. And so in the Bible, in the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the part of the Bible that tells the story of Jesus here on earth, we see him telling many parables. Well, the parable we're going to look at today is a fascinating one, and it's actually one of my favorites. It's actually full of symbolism. Remember, there was no New Testament yet when Jesus was here, and so often when Jesus was teaching, he's referring, no New Testament, so he has to refer to the Old Testament. He's primarily speaking to Jews, so there's all kinds of symbolism tying into the Old Testament, and we're not going to have time to unpack all of that. Here's the big idea that we're going to see in the parable today, is that God's heart beats for the least, last, and lost. If you miss everything else that we are going to look at, if you miss everything else, I hope that you and I can walk away with this truth. God's heart beats for the least, last, and lost. I'm going to circle back around to that. Matthew chapter 25, if you have your Bibles, you can open there. Jesus, at this point, has actually been telling story after story after story. If you read the earlier verses or chapters in Matthew, he's telling parable after parable. A lot of the earlier parables, he's actually speaking to this idea when he's going to come back a second time. Now, the Jews at this time were a little confused by Jesus' first coming, because the prophets had spoke about this Messiah that would one day come. But they assumed that when the Messiah would come, he would come as a conquering king, that he would overthrow the Roman government and give them freedom to be who God promised them to be. Promises that he had made to men like Abraham 2,500 years before, or David 1,000 years before. But the Messiah didn't come quite like they expected. In fact, the first coming of the Messiah, as many of you know, he came as a suffering servant. In fact, his life will end with him allowing them to nail him to a cross. But Jesus starts to tell some stories about his second coming, the one that you and I are waiting for. And he's not going to come back as a suffering servant, but as a conquering king. So one of these stories that Jesus tells about his second coming, the one that we're longing and waiting for, is found in Matthew chapter 25. We pick up the story in verse 31. Jesus says, "But when the Son of Man comes in his glory," now understand, Son of Man is a reference to the book of Daniel. And the Son of Man, if you looked in Daniel, is an introduction to this Messiah that would one day come, that would set up his eternal kingdom. See, I used to teach that when Jesus referred to himself as the Son of Man, it was a way of him humbly connecting himself to humanity. He was fully human while fully God. But that's not all true. To the Jews that would hear Jesus reference himself as the Son of Man, they connected it to what the prophet Daniel said about the Son of Man. And the Son of Man would set up his eternal kingdom. So when Jesus starts, he says, "But when the Son of Man comes in his glory," he's saying, when I come back, I'm going to come back to set up my eternal kingdom. Keep reading. "But when the Son of Man comes in his glory, and all the angels with him, then he will sit upon his glorious throne. All the nations will be gathered in his presence, and he will separate the people as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. He will place the sheep at his right hand and the goats at his left hand." Now let me pause here for just a moment. This is not the kind of story that we would hear today. In fact, many of you maybe didn't grow up in a rural setting or a farm or a ranch type setting, and so this doesn't really make sense. But you need to understand 2,000 years ago, when Jesus is telling this story, he's trying to get them to understand what this future judgment seat is going to look like. He starts talking about separating the sheep and the goats. And everybody in the crowd at this point is nodding their head. They've all seen it. The sheep and goats look very similar. The reason you would separate them is the wool for sheep is valuable. And so you want to get the sheep over here on his right-hand side, and that's where the valuable wool is going to come from, and then you're moving the goats over here. So all the people listening is going, oh, yeah, I get it. He's going to go on, though, and take this illustration or parable or story that they all would recognize in their mind, and he's going to connect it to something that's going to happen. And what you'll see is in that future judgment day, you do not want to be on the left. You want to be on the right. Watch what happens. Keep reading. Verse 34. Then the king, the Son of Man, then the king will say to those on his right, come, you who are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the creation of the world. Don't miss that. Before there was anything, God was already planning this future kingdom. For I was hungry. Okay, here's why he's saying, you come and enjoy this kingdom. Because I was hungry and you fed me. I was thirsty and you gave me drink. I was a stranger and you invited me into your home. I was naked and you gave me clothing. I was sick and you cared for me. I was in prison and you visited me. Now, most stories or most parables that are told or continue to be told today, there's always a little surprise. There's a little twist. And the surprise or the twist in this story is all of a sudden these ones on the right that Jesus is inviting into his kingdom, into this eternal kingdom, he says, this is why you're going to be part of this kingdom. Because when I was hungry, you fed me. When I was thirsty, you gave me something to drink. When I was naked, you clothed me. When I was in prison, you came and visited me. And they say, when? When did we do this? In fact, we're going to look at the next verses, we're going to skip over them. I'm just going to explain them. But if you looked at the next verses, that's what they're saying. They're saying, when did we do this? We don't remember feeding you, Jesus, or clothing you, Jesus, or giving you water, Jesus, or visiting you in prison. When were you in prison? And then Jesus will say, inasmuch as you've done it to the least of these, you've done it unto the enormity of what he's saying there. In our modern day standards, he's saying, when you pulled off the side of the road and helped that person change the tire, it was as if you were doing that for me. When you sponsored that child month after month through an organization, a child that's in a third world country that has no hope of a future, but because of you, they do. When you did that, it was as if you were doing that to me. And imagine all of them going, what? Okay, watch this though. Skip down to verse 41. Then the king will turn to those on the left, you don't want to be on the left, and say, away with you, you cursed ones, into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and the demons. And they're going to have the same response as the sheep on the right. They're going to say, well, when? Because he's going to explain. If we read the next verses, he's going to say, you know why you're going to go there? Is because when I was hungry, you didn't feed me. When I was thirsty, you didn't give me anything to drink. When I was naked, you didn't clothe me. When I was in prison, you didn't come and visit me. And just like the other ones, they're going to be surprised and go, when? We never heard you in prison, Jesus. We never heard you were there. We never heard you were hungry. We never heard that you were thirsty. And he's going to say, the least of these, you did not do it to me. Same thing, only reverse. Change your tire. You missed an opportunity to serve me. When you did not give to help those children in third world countries, you missed your opportunity to serve me. I mean, this should be blowing our mind right now. And some of us have heard this story before. But it should leave us going, oh man. Next time I have an opportunity to serve someone, I better not miss it. Because Jesus is saying, if you drive by, if you turn your head, if you ignore that urging in your heart to do something and you do nothing, you missed your opportunity to serve Jesus himself. Look at how he wraps this up. Skip down to verse 46. And they will go away into eternal punishment, righteous will go into eternal life. A couple of things to note from this parable. Number one, talk of stories in the Bible, and especially those of you that maybe have been in the church for a while, you hear these stories and you go, oh yeah, the parable of the sheep and the goats. But can you imagine that you've never heard this before, and it's Jesus himself standing there 2,000 years ago, you're standing in the crowd, and when he starts to tell the story, can you imagine the people going, whoa, what? And in fact, we should be. Second thing to note is there's no mention of faith. And this should be bothering some of you. There should be some of you, if you've been in the church world very long, that are going, wow, this sounds a lot like a work salvation. I mean, he's separating the sheep and the goats, and he's saying these people get to come into heaven because of what they did, works, and these people are going to hell because what they didn't do, works. It sure seems like this is teaching a works salvation, and yet I've heard that we're saved by faith and faith alone. How does this fit? I don't have time to go into all the details of this, but suffice it to say this. Whenever you're studying the Bible, you always go with what we know, what is taught very clearly. Sometimes there are some passages or stories or verses that seem to contradict, and you got to wrestle with them, and I wish we had more time to wrestle with this one. But suffice it to say that over 200 times in the New Testament alone, we are told that our salvation is by faith and faith alone. You cannot earn your salvation because the standard for salvation with God is perfection, and none of us can do it, which is why Jesus had to come 2,000 years ago. He took your sins and my sins. He died on the cross, and he came back from the dead, proving he had power over sin and death. And over 200 times we're told, your salvation, my salvation, is by faith and faith alone. It's by the grace of God. We cannot work for it. Ephesians 2:8-9. Not by works of righteousness which we have done, but according to his grace, by faith we've been saved. So, it appears that this passage is teaching a work salvation, but it can't be. But I want to go back to the big idea. I wish I had more time to explain that. But I want to go back to the big idea because this is what I don't want us to miss. And I think this is what Jesus was trying to get across 2,000 years ago. Is he was trying to tell those people, and he's trying to tell us today, that God's heart beats for the least, last, and lost. That Jesus is saying, if you want to claim that you are following me, if you want to claim that you're my son or daughter, if you want to claim that you're part of this kingdom, then your heart should beat for the least, last, and lost, because mine does. And that means that you can't ignore the suffering of this world. You can't ignore the widows and the orphans. You can't ignore those groups, those people groups that are marginalized. You must do something. That's what he's saying. And he says this all throughout the Bible. All throughout the Bible. Again, I wish I had more time, but Micah chapter 6, verse 8, where the nation of Israel at that time were doing a lot of religious practices. They were fasting and going to the temple, and they were praying and worshiping, and yet God says through the prophet that you're missing it. Micah 6:8, he has showed you, oh man, what is good and what the Lord requires, not requests, not recommends, but what the Lord requires to act justly. In Isaiah chapter 58, God is again speaking to the nation of Israel. And once again, he's saying, you're doing all these religious practices, you're fasting and you're going to the temple and you're tithing and you're praying and worshiping, but the very thing that those religious practices are supposed to lead you to do, to care for the least, last, and lost, you're missing it. And in Isaiah chapter 58, God says, is this not the kind of fasting that I want to see? To feed the hungry, to clothe the naked, to visit those in prison. And once again, we see that God's heart beats for the least, last, and lost. I wish I had more time. Matthew chapter 23, just days before Jesus is going to be crucified, the last time that he will publicly speak to the religious leaders, he tells them, you tithe 1/10 of your mint, dill, and cumin, these little herbs, but you're missing the more important matters, justice. The Old Testament law, back in Leviticus and Exodus and Numbers, where God sets up all these standards, 613 of them. And we see right in there that God's heart beats for the least, last, and lost. He says, you know what? If you have a big field, I don't want you to plow the corners of the field because there's hungry people and they need to come out and get some food. There's another law that says if someone owes you their cloak, and it's the last way that they can pay you is they give you their outer cloak. That's how they pay off their debt to you. Every night you bring that cloak back. You own it now, but you bring that cloak back to them so that they can stay least, last, and lost. And in this parable in Matthew chapter 25, Jesus is pointing to the end where this judgment will happen. And one of the things that is going to be so valuable to him at that time is how did we walk with the poor? How did we walk with the widows? How did we walk with the orphans? How did we walk with the marginalized people groups? God's heart beats for the least, last, and lost. In a moment, you're going to separate. You're going to go into some of the Zoom chat rooms for a discussion. Man, I hope you really wrestle with this. I hope that each of us will process this. And even if you've been doing pretty well with living this out, you'll go, I want to step it up. I want to do a heart beats for the least, last, and lost. God, we love you. Jesus, thank you so much for this story. And thank you that your heart beats for the least, last, and lost, because there's not one of us that isn't part of that list. I don't care how rich we were when we were born. I don't care what kind of lower class, middle class, upper class home we grew up in, but all of us were lost. Jesus, that your heart beats for the least, last, and lost. And if you care for them, so should we. May we be a people group, and we be a group of men that passionately walk with the marginalized and the